Okay, welcome everyone. We are excited today for another clinical conversation. And I'm excited. This is kind of a full circle moment for our guest today, which we'll explain in a minute. But we're going to be talking about special education school social work. I have worked in schools for many, many, many years. This is a passion of mine. I have a master's in special education too, so I could talk about this forever and ever. But we are so excited today to have Mariah Peloso with us, and how this is a full circle moment is I met Mariah way back when she was studying for her licensing exam, and now here we are talking about a really cool clinical topic. So I will kind of give an introduction. I'll do our housekeeping, and then I want to make sure we get plenty of time with Mariah to talk about her experience. So Mariah is a licensed clinical social worker, and she is the owner of Releve Wellness and Counseling. So we'll talk a little bit about her experiences there. A little bit of background about me is I am the founder of Agents of Change Social Work Test Prep, and now we have moved into the continuing education space, so we're excited about that. I have my hands in a lot of different buckets. School social work was a huge passion of mine. I'm working on my play therapy credential. I work in private practice, and I also am getting my doctorate right now. And in my doctorate, I am focusing on multicultural supervision, multicultural group consultation, and I also have a big passion for technology, so how we can use tech to make our lives easier. So that's a little bit about me. And then let me tell you a little bit about Mariah. She graduated from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, with her bachelor's and master's in social work, so BSW and MSW. She holds a PEL school social work license. That is Illinois specific, right, Mariah?
Yeah.
Yes. And she has her LCSW. She's been working with special and general education. Now she's in private practice, research, public speaking, and grant funded projects. She's going to talk a little bit about her current experience. It's really cool, the work she's doing. She's now in Texas, working in the DFW area. And she's going to talk about special education, mental health services, and school systems. So we're really excited about that. Before we get into our conversation, here's our learning objectives for our clinical conversation. Participants will be able to identify and explain the role of cultural competency in special education. We're going to get into this, and I have some thoughts around it as well. Participants will be able to develop collaborative strategies for supporting school personnel and students. Schools are very multidisciplinary. You do not work solo. Oftentimes, parents are involved, teachers, service providers. We'll talk about that. And then lastly, we're going to touch on briefly the role of social workers in advocacy and policy change for special education and what we can do just on an individual level. And then we'll talk about some of the systems or policies that exist there for our students as well. Why is this topic important? We're going to touch on this, but we want to address educational inequities. Specifically, I know we're going to get into children with IEPs, children with diagnosed disabilities. We want to be able to enhance student well-being and academic success. Kids spend a lot of time in school, more time than they do at home. So I think school is a really important place that we address academic success, overall well-being, all of those different holistic supports we can give students. And then lastly, we'll talk about professional development, interdisciplinary collaboration. It's a system where you work with a lot of different professionals, and not everyone is well-versed in the mental health space. So we will talk a little bit about that as well. So without further ado, I want to kick it over to Mariah. So Mariah, welcome, and just take a moment to introduce yourself and the work that you do.
All right. Thanks, Megan. Thanks for having me. As mentioned, I'm Mariah Peloso. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. As mentioned, I am licensed in Illinois and Texas as I moved to Texas about 2 years ago. Most of my experience has been as a special education social worker, but depending on the district and what my position was, I might have covered some general education and had more flexibility to do more of that as well. I've also had experience working as a behavior specialist within special education, And then now I currently work at a school in the urban DFW area in general education, where it's much more clinical based, a lot of consultative and short term services. And then the district I work for has a clinic that's attached to it. So I do a lot of referring out there and referring students and families to various resources to help them get acclimated to school and life environment or any changes that happen. And then also I
Awesome.
have my,
And
or, oh, sorry. I was going to
go
add, and then
ahead. I
I
want to hear
just,
about your private practice.
thank you. So I've done some work in practice for someone else before when I was a master level social worker. But as of last summer, so it's been about maybe 8 months or so, I started my practice. It's all virtual. I specialize in working with women with anxiety and ADHD from a trauma informed lens. And then I've recently started diving into some somatic modalities in work, which is brain body connection. And I just got certified in trauma conscious yoga method. And so that's been something that's been really fun and exciting to bring into practice with both the kids at school and the adults that I see in the evenings in my practice.
Yes, that's awesome. Mariah and I kind of have similar experiences where we had our interests lying in different areas, right? She's got her private practice doing somatic work and in the schools, and I had similar. I had the interest in learning how diverse brains work. I work a lot with neurodivergent individuals and bringing that into my work, into schools and with kids too. So we're always kind of meshing our different interests together to inform our practice. So that's awesome. Share a little bit with us about what you do day to day in the school setting. And you said it's a little bit different than other school settings you've worked in. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. So as mentioned, this is my first job that isn't special education based. So a lot of adjusting. So right now, the model that the district I work for uses is 3-2-1. So you either have 3 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, or 1 high school. And so for some reason, over the past 5 years, elementary school continues to find me. So that's where I'm at. And it's great. It's grown on me. It wasn't my first pick in the beginning, but once I got adjusted and was receiving all the love that you get from younger kids, it grew on me. So I'm happy. But right now, I alternate between visiting all of the schools on a regular basis. Once a week, I meet with each of the counselors just to consult, touch base, see what concerns are coming up, both on an individual and school wide level. A lot of discussing, I might give them recommendation as to some of the supports they can give. And then after the counselors have attempted interventions, and if there's no progress being seen, or if there is an underlying mental health problem or trauma that's going on, then they'll refer to me. And we have a referral system where I'll reach out to parents and I talk to parents and offer them or let them know the things that mental health services has to offer. And kind of just give them my recommendation as to if school-based services, which are more short-term, and that's where I'm at, would lie, or if they would benefit from some of the clinic services, which are long-term. They also offer family therapy, and there's a psychiatrist on staff, and all of it is free to kids and families of the district, which is really cool.
That's awesome. I just think from a standpoint, I've worked in schools where we did not necessarily have all of these in-house resources, how impactful this can be to have this available to students, because we know that there can be wait lists outside of school systems and a child's in the school system. So being able to provide that in-house, I'd be curious what you have seen about providing in-house services versus having to have them go on really long wait lists or not be able to access it.
So school, honestly, a lot of the kids that I get referrals for, they end up being a clinic case. However, we still run into that same issue because there's only so many clinics in the district, and there's so many schools that funnel into each clinic. And I know the clinic that funnels into my schools right now, they just got a second therapist. Like they were just one person for a while. So waitlisted, right? But then also there's the barrier of communication and parents
Yep.
answering the phone or having an interpreter or someone bilingual, that kind of thing. So oftentimes the referrals only get as far as to the school, and it ends up turning into myself or the counselors tracking down the parent, or giving some kind of incentive to the kid, like, hey, I got a candy bar, what's your name on it, if you can come back with this form signed, because it can be so
Yeah.
difficult to get in touch with the parents. And another I guess barrier that comes into play sometimes is the lack of parent involvement at times. However, you get touch and go with involvement with teachers and other staff in the building, which I can get into a little bit later.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that multidisciplinary piece. Like schools are a system where you work with a lot of different people, kids, parents, like I said, service providers, teachers. It can be a lot of different people that you have to manage those relationships. But first, I'd be curious to know a little bit about your experiences with working. You said it was primarily special education, but now it's more general education. What were those two different experiences like? And how does it both experiences inform your work?
Um, so I will say again, it depends on a multitude of factors how that ends up panning out. So my very first job in the field was in the suburbs of Chicago. Um, there was two school social workers on staff, which is very rare.
Yeah.
And so we both were responsible for different age groups. So she had third through fifth grade, and I had pre-K through second grade. Mind you, when I was in college, I learned like I did my one special education class in undergrad, like I took care of it earlier on because I was warned about it and I knew I had a plan for what I wanted to do in my career. But other than that, I had not learned anything about special education. I had done my practicums in a general education setting in high schools. So
Wow.
it was a complete 180, a huge learning curve year. And I look back now, and honestly, I only had about 9 kids on my IEP caseload, but because I was still learning a new age group and the language of special education, it felt like a lot. And then I had all these kids through MTSS, which is multi-tier system of supports, a lot of tier two interventions, so group work, consulting with teachers, that kind of thing. And then seeing if we need to go tier three, which is, in other words, going onto the SPED route in a lot of situations. But I will say that first job, it was very heavy on both. But no matter what, if you're in those positions, SPED is always first because it's all law abiding documents.
Yes.
And yes, and then I will say after that year, I went to a urban school district, and there I worked for the district rather than the school itself. So
Interesting. Yeah.
I would always have at least two schools at a time. Their schools were either K or pre-K through 8, so wider variety. And then I got tossed around and yanked around like a yo-yo throughout my time there. But I will say that's when I learned the most, because I had to get acclimated with various populations and demographics. I had to learn to be flexible. I had to learn to manage my time very heavily because it was this job in particular was very sped heavy. So, I mean, if I caught a kid in the hallway having a hard time, I'd stop and support. But a lot of my job was sped because I had all of these evaluations. I had to still meet minutes, like trying to get a hold of parents, trying to, do all the things. So there wasn't as much space to do it. And I know that district at the time was trying to hire so many more social workers so each school could have one, but they weren't there yet. So we were at two, still splitting our time and doing the sped thing. But I will say I've always made it an effort to still try to become a part of the community. And I think when I did find consistency, like when they kept me at the same two schools for a while, I did have success in building that. And both my sped kids and the general ed kids and the teachers like knew who I was, knew I was a support they could lean on. But it was just a matter of time being of the essence because I was only at this school for 2 days and that one for 3. But I think that the other nice side of that is that it organically created some healthy boundaries. So they weren't always relying on me every single day and minute. Um, but yeah, I would say those are the biggest differences. And then I will say in my behavior specialist gig, that was very strictly sped, very consultative. I might check in with the kid, but that was a lot more consultative and giving, teachers and maybe parents sometimes recommendations. And then there was some FBA work in there, which I had done in my social work sped jobs as well. But at the time, they hadn't really built out that piece of it at the district before I left, and I didn't stay at that job for very long. But in a nutshell, that has been my experience with SPED. Like I said, I kind of fell into it because when I moved back from college, there was only SPED jobs in Chicago, so that's what I ended up going
Yeah.
for. But I will say the job I have now was what I pictured to be my like dream school job in a lot of ways. But I'm so glad that I learned SPED law and had my experience in SPED first because it has made this job so much smoother.
Yeah. A little bit about my background in SPED and how this came to be. And for those of you that are listening, SPED is there's in schools, there's so many acronyms, right? There should be a handbook of all the acronyms that we use in the school system. So SPED is special education. I was a school social worker in Washington, D.C. I did that for nearly 10 years, many different parts of the city, different socioeconomic demographics. So I got to see it all. And I was working a lot with the children, and what I found was I was working so much with children with IEPs, learning needs, behavior challenges. So I actually, because of this, I felt that I was not informed enough about, because special education is legally binding. There is IDA exists, right? And these students have rights under the law. I felt like I did not know that piece enough, and I didn't know the learning piece enough. So I went back and got my master's in special education because I saw there was such a gap, right? There's so many social workers working with students with IEPs in special education. And like you said, we maybe had one course on it one time. It's really
Mhm.
learning on your feet on the job. So that is really what shaped so much of my work. Now I work with neurodivergent kiddos because I have learned how much need there is and how much advocacy work needs to happen for these kiddos. And there's just a lot of lack of awareness across the board. Even teachers, parents. So there's a lot of psychoeducation that goes around in that too. So this is a very near and dear part of my career and my life too. So we're speaking the same language here, Mariah. I definitely you have to learn quickly in school social work, particularly when you're working with special education. And there's that piece that you are legally, I say this all the time, there are legal obligations under the law that we have to follow. So that includes IEP meetings, that includes, evaluations, that includes observations, and it includes giving the services that the children need. So it's definitely less flexible because you have to meet those demands of what is in the child's IEP. So it's amazing to hear that your caseload was 9 at that time. Talk about burnout. I think at my peak, I had maybe 27 children with IEP mandates. And that you have to think, we can't extend the school day. We can't add time onto a school day or a school week.
Mhm.
So I was trying to get all sorts of creative, running groups, finding ways that I could get all of these hours in. I think I calculated at one time, and it was actually not even possible to see individually all the kids that needed to be seen. So that goes into like a whole nother, we actually can talk about this a little bit. It's a segue into the advocacy and the policy piece. What are some barriers you saw within schools, or still continue to see within schools, that prevent not only kids from getting the services that they need, but as from the social work perspective, that are barriers to having any sort of work-life balance? There's such, since the pandemic especially, there's such burnout amongst people working in schools.
Ooh, that's a
That's
loaded
a big one.
question. Yes. Hold on, I gotta break this one up. And I think my answer is gonna very much differ across, again, the district or the population demographic and all those things. Um, I'm gonna kind of go back into what you were just talking about, but then leaning into what you're
Yeah,
asking now. But first job, I got spoiled, 9 IEP kids, but then I had like 35 MTSS. So it panels out, but it's still nothing compared to having to write IEPs, right?
yeah.
But then the next job, easily 30 to 50 kids at a time.
Wow.
And the way, like, I'll talk a little bit on the creative ways I got. So one, advocating to my manager to demand like needing some support, or making sure that the case managers, because the case managers are the ones who schedule all these meetings, and we're supposed to have a timeline. I know in Illinois it was 60 days to like complete your evaluation process and get your report written. And sometimes we would have the domain meeting where like all the providers are sitting at the table to see who's going to domain in to evaluate to see if the kid is eligible for special education services. And so we would have this meeting, and some of these case managers would schedule like 2 weeks out. And it's like, technically, if I'm at two schools and this is 2 weeks out and I'm at that school 2 days a week, that gives me 4 days to do my job on top of all the minutes I still have to meet to see kids, the other pending evaluations I have, following up with parents who haven't finished the evals or the assessments that I've sent and that kind of thing. So there's a lot happening. But as far as advocating, it was really important for me to advocate for myself at that job to prevent burnout. As far as, needing support with the caseload, advocating to have the case managers take into consideration our time and, being able to give us ample time to create a quality report. getting creative in the way that we make accommodations and make it accessible to both the kids and the teachers without everyone getting overwhelmed. What else? Advocating in what they would call the manifestation determination
Yes.
meeting, when a kid that's in special education, when they get into some kind of behavioral trouble, by law, this manifestation determination meeting is required to have, so that the IEP team can sit at the table and determine whether or not that behavior was a result of their disability or not. And I will say, I noticed at one table I sat at, like, everyone was so quick, even the psychologist was so quick to say wasn't a result. And I'm like, well, one could argue, like, we know this kid has gone through a lot of trauma. So, and
Yes.
she also has a specific learning disability. And that was honestly the biggest trend that I noticed at my very busy special education job, where I was working in an urban setting. Um, a lot of the kids qualified under specific learning disability, but oftentimes it was because they had a lot of trauma. Their ACEs scores were really high. And so even in that case, it was like having to advocate for that. And then also just even thinking about how in that particular situation was different from my urban job setting. This was a suburban job setting in the DFW area. But just seeing how the conversation changed when, it was a non-white kid that we were meeting about, and how some of the different behaviors and their emotions show up differently across cultures, and just bringing awareness to the team on these things.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the cultural piece because I think as providers, anyone that works in any space, we have to be mindful of this. And we know that we work in a system. There's certain, you have to meet this criteria, right? I worked at schools with such high trauma that almost every kid would meet that criteria for some sort of specific learning disability. So it's really
Mhm.
hard for us to work within systems. And then that brings me back to, even if we are in any setting, the DSM is very pathologizing, right? It's do you boom, 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 boom. So I think as a provider, it's mindful to know that sometimes I try to tell parents too, like, we are going to classify. I hate how pathologizing and like putting labels it is on things, but we are working within the system. And this, what I tell parents, whether it be if they're getting a special education diagnosis or they're going to a psychiatrist and getting a diagnosis, to me personally, the diagnosis does not matter, right? What matters is that this can help you get the resources that you need and get your child the resources that you need. And that can be really, really, really tough. You have some
Mhm.
you have some people that fight that, right? Like, no, I don't want my kid to be labeled as another kiddo in special education. And then you have others that maybe know the benefits that it can have, and they're trying to over identify, like, or they'll hire, and if you have resources, you can pay for outside people to talk you through this. So a lot of it is psychoeducation to parents. I don't know about you. I've sat through so many IEP meetings where I did not agree with what the team was saying. And I had to make that known. Like, this is where the multidisciplinary approach comes in. Maybe a teacher disagrees with me. Maybe every single person at the table disagrees with me, because as social workers, we have a different mindset. We have a different way of looking at things. And I just made it very known. I'm an advocate for this child, and this is my clinical recommendation. So I think it's such a tricky job. It's such a tricky job. But going back to that cultural piece is, and I have talked about this a lot, we don't know what parents come to the table with. We don't know if they themselves had
Mhm.
very negative experiences with the school system. I've had parents that it
Yes.
seemed very much like, I don't want to come, like, it seemed right, without investigating or building those relationships, they're disengaged. They're not answering. We we unpack things a little bit more. They had their own trauma in the school systems. They were put in a
Mhm.
self-contained classroom. They were labeled as having a learning disability, and they do not want to go down that route with their child. And once we had the opportunity to unpack that, it was like, whoa, okay, now we can really work with so much more here.
Yeah, so true. And I'm so glad you brought up the part about the parents, because, in some of the questions that you sent me prior to this, when I thought about barriers and things I wish that they would have taught in grad school, I'm like, no one touched on like the stages of grief we're going to have to address with these parents when you're telling them that their kid has a disability. And I think especially once COVID hit, that prompted me to have a lot more compassion and, well, honestly, capacity to offer compassion to parents. Because I remember before telehealth got cleared in Illinois, we were just told to call the parents of our IEP kids. I call all of my kids parents. I got a lot of people didn't answer, but the ones who answered, it gave me a whole new understanding for, what was going on with that adult, outside of their child, and just getting to know them and having compassion for them because they're people too. Like they're just kids who grew up.
Yes.
But yes, and I think just learning, it's almost like, I mean, in the way you have to get buy-in from your stakeholders, like it's almost like there's a lot of strategy behind being able to advocate for these kids to get them what they need. And it starts with parents and meeting where they are in the grief process, teachers, because they're overloaded. So it's like, I wish somebody would have taught me the play by play, but from experience, we figure it out.
Yeah.
And now we're here and we're doing it and we're hopefully passing it on to those who need it as well.
Yeah, I actually would say, I'm very passionate about this. So I would go like someone was like, you are such a fierce advocate for your students. And I was like, if adults in the building can't even advocate for them, why are we even here? What are we even doing? Right. So I'm a very big person on like, I would say to parents, these are your rights and you can get an outside advocate to help you at any time. You can bring any person you
Mm-hmm.
want into these meetings. I would say that piece was huge. A lot of times parents don't know it. If anyone listening has ever sat in an IEP meeting or has not sat, the rights parents have, it's like, how big is that stack of documents that they get? It's like so much legal jargon. It's so much stuff. I have read through it before and I still don't know half of the terms in there. So it is
Yeah, it's
such a
overwhelming.
hard process to manage.
It is like, and I've had parents come to this table that know nothing about education, and they have this team of professionals sitting around them, throwing around this jargon, also adding in that, oh, by the way, your kid has a disability. Like, parents break down. It's like, whoa, this is too much, too soon, too fast. Like, we got to ease them in.
Yeah.
We got to make sure they are understanding. We have to meet them where they are.
And I think that's where social work can come. Social workers, mental health professionals have that different lens. We're not like a business as
Yes.
usual, right? We are in the business of interpersonal connection and interpersonal relationship. So I have very many times, even we as social workers are very in tune, right? Sometimes case managers, they are very good at their job, but they're not there to debrief with the parents or process what just happened. And I have left many, many, many meetings that I can tell that parent is completely deflated, right? They walk out of there
Hmm.
or they've been very not just withdrawn and deflated, very angry. That on my end, I'm sure you've probably done this too, Mariah. I'm going to reach out to that parent after and say, you know what, do you
Hmm.
need to hop on a call with me or how can we process this together? I could see you were frustrated, those type of things. And I have found that when they have someone that they see as like very much trying to understand how this process is for them, it goes a really long way.
Yes, absolutely. I 1,000% agree. Oh, so I was going to add on to that. Those things are all important. And I think I'm going to speak from the perspective on which I entered the field. I was really young my first year. I was 23 years old. And my
Yep.
first job was in a space where I was the only person who looked like me. And I didn't know it until my first day of work. So lots of shock, again, all the changes that were coming with it. And I think for me then and throughout a lot of my time working, I've had to gain some sense of self and some confidence in my perspective. And one, it's great to be aware of the biases that might come at you because of how you're being received and how you appear and how people can take that. But I think there is something really valuable in one, going to therapy yourself. The urban job was what prompted me to go because I needed to have some healthy boundaries because of how high stress and demanding that job was. And two, I needed confidence and sense of self so I could feel confident in my work and also for advocating for those kids. So the work it
Absolutely.
doesn't stop in the classroom. Like you got to go unpack stuff for yourself so you are in a space where you can show up for these kids to help them get what they need.
Absolutely. And I have a very different perspective. I often was the white person of privilege at this table
Mhm.
working with BIPOC communities. It was never lost on me, and it's still not lost on me that that has an impact. And right, like coming power dynamics, right? And having to be very mindful of maybe parents are coming in with preconceived notions about me and what I'm going to do. And that's a thing that I don't think sometimes other multidisciplinary people within a school are, it's not as important to them because they maybe don't even have a code of ethics that they operate
Right.
from. It's very important for the work that we do. I will say, even in my time in schools, so much more of a push towards trauma-informed care and cultural humility, cultural competency, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So talking about those barriers and the cultural humility piece, Mariah and I were talking. I worked at a school with a high Spanish speaking population. I cannot tell you how many meetings we sat in where the documents were not translated into their home language. Talk about a barrier right there. Talk about what that signals to the parent. I've had many meetings where we don't have a translator, right? How are we going to be talking about this child in a language that's not even comfortable for the person at the table? So that's like more of an advocacy piece. For a lot of times there's services that are lacking. You're in Texas, right? So I would be curious to know about, from a cultural standpoint, what barriers you face and maybe where there's a lack of resources for families that are either linguistically diverse or have come from diverse backgrounds.
Great question. So I will say the district that I work for is very much a unicorn compared to some of the districts around. However, because it is such a heavily populated district, the resources can only be spread so thin. But there is a big newcomer population, like people coming in from out of the country for the first
Yes.
time. So needs for interpreters all the time. I am calling interpreter hotline almost every day to call parents and
Wow.
consult, or if there's somebody, and sometimes you got to do what you got to do, honestly. Like if
Yeah.
there's someone at the front desk who speaks Spanish and I need to converse with a parent for 5 minutes, they can help me. And people are usually very open as long as they have the time and the space to help, which is nice. I will say, because there's such a heavy Spanish speaking population, that part is pretty supported in the district I'm in now. However, there are kids and families that are coming from all over the world, and I'm not directly impacted by very many that are outside of Spanish, but I know depending on what side of the city that you're on, you'll run into people who have other languages. Like what was one? Farsi was one I came across
Yes.
actually, and I had to go through a whole nother process to get an interpret or a translator for this meeting I wasn't even going to be at. It was like for a teacher to talk to this parent about this kid and
Advocacy.
his behavior. Yeah. So it's like, but I know other people have to go through that process very frequently. And when you've got three schools to cover and you're still seeing your own kids doing consult, that can be a lot on a person. And like some of these elementary schools aren't small. Like my biggest one is 1,200 kids.
That's a small city, right?
Oh, no, not at all. Oh, you mean yes, yes. Sorry, I was thinking about where I was. No, yeah, no, and I
No, I'm
think that,
saying that could be like a small
yes,
city of kids, like
exactly. That's a
1,200
high
kiddos.
school.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, but luckily, and I know when I first started that job, I was very overwhelmed by that aspect. I think that plus the getting used to having a translator present, like, was draining me more than I anticipated.
Yeah.
Just because, you're sitting there and you're talking, but you're also in some way trying to understand it because you want to pick it up to an extent, but you're also trying to formulate and do your job. It's a lot of brain work happening. It can be very overwhelming. But I think that, and then plus when I saw the numbers, so I've got one school, 1,200 kids, 800, 500. Those are all my populations. I remember when I first saw those numbers, I quickly advocated to my manager. I don't know if this is fair compared to like the way other people's numbers are split up. And she was like, just take a breath. Like you're not there covering the school. They have their counselors and you're there to really support and see where they want you to fill in. But she kind
Okay.
of prefaced me and let me know that it wasn't going to be as big as I thought. And honestly, it hasn't been, like once I got acclimated. But when you see those numbers, it does feel big and scary and overwhelming because there are needs. But honestly, the ones that are that big, they have two counselors. Like the 1,200 population school, they're really supposed to have three, but I don't think they ever filled the third position. But there's always going to be need. You fill in where you can, and you really only get to fill in with the capacity of what the counselors give you, because that's your main point of contact. Because could you imagine working? So one of my mentors, she makes the joke. She is like, it's like having three boyfriends and dealing with their dysfunctional families. Like, could you imagine having to communicate with all three of those dysfunctional families? Like, it would, my head would explode. So I always, from the beginning when I send out my welcome letter to the school, I mention who I am and what I do, and then the process. So I usually will try to come to like their orientation meeting or something where the counselors are introducing themselves, just so my face is in the air. And I always just lay it out like anything. Go to the counselors. We meet on a weekly basis, and we delegate based on need. Um,
Yeah.
but I will say this school, there are a lot of things that help. However, some of the barriers that can be, I'm not sure if I said this on camera or not. But sometimes the services only go as far as getting to the school and they don't make it to the clinic because parents not answering the phone. If the clinic gets waitlisted. So it ends up being this bargaining. Again, I'm sorry if I already repeated this in this one, but again, it ends up being this like trying to get the kid to go get the form signed, even though you talk to parents said, cool, but I can't see you until I have a signature. And there's a digital one. No one ever signs it, honestly, like to be honest. But I'll get a paper one and I'll be like, hey, what's your favorite candy? I got a Snicker bar for you if you bring this back signed. You know how quick some of
Gotta
those
be creative.
yes, those come back real quick when there's candy or some kind of treat or reward involved.
I love that. I don't no longer work in the schools, but you just be creative. Is this you literally walk them out to their parent or you I have this is where a boundaries issue with schools. There are some people that are very good about their boundaries, right? Like school ends at 4, I'm out the door at 4. But I have done this because it's what was in the best interest of the kid. And I do not recommend doing this very often, but like I have maybe had to stay an hour later because they're in aftercare and I have to, because there's stuff going on, I have to like get face to face with someone of this
Absolutely.
that is involved in this person's life. So like this is the hard thing about schools is there's the school hours, but parents work. What are the barriers that parents have? Some parents
Mhm.
rely very much on before care or after care or babysitters or other people or it can be really, really, really challenging, but it has given me so much empathy for all the stuff that goes on in a parent's life and like for educators. And I cannot enough like say that school systems are very broken. There's a lot that needs to be fixed with it, but I think for someone entering the field, knowing knowing these things can be really helpful, not only to help you advocate for your students, but if you don't advocate for yourself, you will burn out. You will absolutely burn out. To be completely transparent, I will probably be doing school social work for the rest of my life if it wasn't for COVID and remote work allowing for more flexibility. It is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful job, but it's a hard job. It's a very, very,
It
very hard.
it is. I agree. And you know, Megan and where we were talking earlier about just our plans and goals within social work, and I shared with you this is what I plan to be my last year in the schools. And as much as I love the work, I've just noticed for myself, my nervous system isn't responding
Yes.
positively to it anymore. And like I got to a point last year where my doctor and my therapist were like asking me questions that had to make me come to that conclusion. Like my doctor seemed like relieved when I told her I had a practice. She's like, oh, okay, good. Like it was like a okay, good. You've got a plan out, and I'm like, oh,
Eye-opening.
okay. Like yeah, because there were some things that were coming up with my health that were being affected by it. Because
Yes.
summer would roll around and I'd be cool as a cucumber. So I think that was my indicator. I'm like, okay, I think my time's up. But I've loved it for everything that it's been. It's taught me so much, and I can't even say that I wouldn't be back. I think my nervous system just needs a break because
Yes.
schools really is community work. It's so far from just individual, but it's community.
I miss so many aspects of it. And maybe I'm on my journey to resetting my nervous system, but there's nothing like a school community. I don't know if you or anyone's listening. Do you watch Abbott Elementary or know about Abbott Elementary?
Yeah, I think I saw most of the first season.
Yeah, it is the most if you are thinking of getting into schools, anyone listening out there, watch Abbott Elementary. It is so accurate, right? Of just like I was just watching last night. Maybe this was a subconscious thing because I was preparing for this, but there was an episode. I swear this will tie back somehow. And this is from the teacher's perspective, though. She had a child in her class that had lots of behavior. She was doing all the things she could to manage it. And then at some point, the behaviors picked up. And she called the parent in for a meeting after trying everything. This is the main character for those of you that don't know about Abbott Elementary. She tried everything and she called the parent in And she said, let's partner as a team. She was doing everything in your arsenal that you should do when meeting with parents. And the parent said, it's your job when they're in school, it's your job to do this. And basically told the teacher, like, this is not my problem. You've just wasted my time and you're terrible at your job. And then the mom just abruptly walked out. And just, we do encounter these things, right? I
Mm-hmm.
and the whole point of the episode was the teacher was so deflated, saying I'm the worst. Talk to other people in the building, and they're like, you know what? This, talking to a veteran teacher, this has happened to me maybe 3 times a year, and I've been doing this for 20 years. Like, this is not going to be the first time you have someone that is very upset with you, and it's not going to be the last, right? So just, it is such a good, accurate description that it's not all like rainbows and butterflies. We're not like, yes, we're going to partner with you. And parents are like, this is amazing. Sometimes you get people, we don't know what's going on in their life. I have no idea what's going on in their life that they might not want to share with us, but it can be very challenging at times. And that's, I think, probably, if I had to guess what was going on in this episode, that parent probably had a lot of other stressors in their life going on. And school is school for, like, I have work, I drop my kid off at school, you take care of it. I take care of it at home, you take care of it at school. I've seen that attitude a lot.
Yes,
So
agreed. And because of that, because I also have run into that very many times, and because of it, it puts me in a space to have the need to set up the expectations from the beginning. Like, hey, I'm a tool. I'm enthusiastic about supporting. However, the only way this is going to work is if we're all doing something different. So because I'm a
yes,
new person that's in this picture, I'm going to be doing something different. So I'm also going to be giving you teacher and you parent some suggestions. And I know you got a lot going on. I know you got a lot going on. So I'm not going to give you a whole bunch to do outside of what you're doing. I just want to give you some things that you can implement into what you're already doing. Yeah. And some
absolutely.
people,
I think,
you got to, I was going to say, you got to know your audience, but with some people, you got to just
yes,
give it to them straight. Like, I'm like, if we're not all doing this, this is a waste of time. Like, it's
yeah.
counterproductive. Parents, you're your kid's first teacher. Like, they're learning from you. So, like, how are we going to find, like, where's it, like, what's the word? We've got to find a way to meet halfway and find some common ground with
Yes.
all of the stakeholders if we
Any
want
common
this to
ground.
be
Yep.
successful. Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also I was thinking when you were saying like finding common ground, a lot of times people say, well, what a barrier can be lack of what we perceive as parent involvement, but we got to think of why are they not involved? Like, what's going on in their own life? Or is this, I've
Hmm.
had so many times the schools offering events midday. How many parents can take off work to go? There's a
Right.
cultural, right? Or if people are working multiple jobs, like that doesn't even give
Hmm.
them the opportunity to be involved in their school's community. So think of that
Right.
as a barrier. But the common ground, some people have asked me, like, how do I get through? Sometimes I'll just give this piece of advice. I think it's a good one to any, I use it all the time still. If you're trying to build rapport with a parent, a question I love to ask parents is, what are your hopes and dreams for your kid? And just like having them think of that. And then I use that as a leverage point. Okay, guess what? I want your kid to be a nice, kind person too. So, like, how can we as a team work together to get you to get those hopes and dreams to be a reality for your kid? So, I think like strengths-based perspective, right? Instead of coming in like
Hmm.
boom, 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 your kid is tearing up the classroom and they're falling behind in this and this. Let's take a step back and what do you want for your child? You don't want me to be calling you all the time. You don't want teachers to be
Right.
calling you all the time. So where can we find the strengths here to build upon?
I love the way that you worded it or the way that I typically will word it, I'll ask about the goals and their hopes, but I'll go on, and I do this with my private practice clients too, but I'll say, what are you willing to do to meet the goal?
I
Because
love that.
that gives me, yeah, I was going to say it goes hand in hand with what you're saying, but it definitely helps you to gauge the stage of change that they're in. And to see, like, because I know in private practice, like, most of the women I work with, they're all like just about anything, and they really mean it when they say it, which is beautiful, and it's fun because they're flexible, they're open, and they do the work. School a little bit more complex because it's not just one person you're working with, right? But it is very informative to hear what parents have to say when you ask that question. But also, I want to segue into how it comes up with kids, because I've brought this question up with kids, particularly when I was in Chicago in the more urban setting. particularly between fourth and sixth grade. Kids were so cruel to each other, and it was affecting some of my students' motivation to want to come to social work services because some kids would be teasing them and saying that, they're different or they're special or just being mean. And so they would come in and they would, discuss with me this view that they have on services, and I'd stop them in their tracks. I'm like, first of all, that's rude, and I'm sorry you're having to experience that. However, and I'd break down to them, the education system, or there are 7 learning styles, and the education system only caters to 2 of those. So if you're outside of those 2, you might get looked at like you have a learning difference, and that's okay. It's not you, it's the system. And I said, and at some
Yes.
point, someone that really cared about you saw that you were having a hard time and they brought it to a table to be discussed, and you were able to get these services that you need to thrive in school and in life. So that's what we're here for. And then I also, because some of them had questions, and legally the age to come into the IEP meetings is what, 13 or 12 and a half?
I think it depends because I've had it
Yeah.
depends on the state. So
Yeah,
yeah.
depends. But I would, because kids were curious, and I think to even get them involved, I went a solid month where I just pulled each kid one by one. I showed them their IEP, I showed them their PLAF, I showed them their goals, and the responses were so enlightening because,
Yes.
mind you, again, a lot of the kids I was working with were specific learning disability as a result of trauma. So it wasn't like they couldn't comprehend what we were looking at. They just needed to see it and have some understanding as to the way that they were being perceived and what their goal is.
Yes.
And for one, like, this is why I am so intentional about the way I write these IEPs, because you want to write it as if that kid is going to look at it tomorrow.
Yes. And they
Like, you
have
don't
the
you don't
right
want,
to do that. Yeah.
exactly. And in that moment, I was giving kids that right to show them, and they saw the way that some other adults may have framed them in writing. And it's like, some of it was sad, some of it, even with the sadness came awareness. So it was like, oh shit, like, I am just I am not making anyone's life easier, including my own. And I'm like, but I am here to
Yes.
help you with tools to meet that. And then they would see their goal, and we talk about, okay, how do you want to get there? Like, and I give them power of choice because I'm all about self determination. And I just saw such a turn in a lot of their attitudes about being there after we did that. However, I think also the universe allowed it to happen when it did, because I ended up getting a new job and moving like right after I went through that process with them. But I think those kids really needed to see what those things were. I
Yeah.
printed out their IEPs for them, and I highlighted where there are accommodations, where I said, these are your accommodations and this is what this could look like. We role played how they advocate. I said, raise your hand. You could say, I'm having a hard time. Can I take a break? Or I'm having a hard time. Can I get that squishy? Like, because I would give teachers these tools. And even for kids where it might have been embarrassing, I was like, okay, well, we do the zones, your feelings by color. So how about I give you some note cards and colored pencils. And if you're having a hard time, have them colored because mindfulness. So it'll help them get regulated right there. And then they can put it to the side so it's discreet. And the teacher knows it's time for them to take a break or do whatever they got to do that we've all discussed amongst ourselves.
That agency piece and that advocacy piece is huge. And a lot of times kids just want to feel they have control over their lives in some
Yes.
aspect. Think of how controlled they are. They are very controlled throughout the day. And I've had some kids too that said, I'm going to talk to your teacher. Do you want to be there? And they're like, why do you talk to my teacher? And then we have that conversation. They're like, oh, wait, you actually like talk about me and want to give me resources and tools that help me? And I said, yes. And I will give, depending on the age, I will say, do you want me to, they'll say, I'm just thinking of I work in private practice now, but I was telling a kid, oh, I'm going to meet with the school. And the kid was telling me all the things that are very, very frustrating to them throughout the day. Mom was shocked by this. I was shocked by this because what does the report card say? Doing great, right? So on every piece of paper, the child is seen as being competent, up to standards. And then when we asked a little bit about what's going on, it was, I feel that the day moves too fast. Literally, a fourth grade child told me, my brain doesn't process information fast enough as the class is moving. And I was like, oh my gosh, this
Wow.
was such a light bulb moment. I wrote it down and I said, this is amazing. Have you ever told your teachers, anyone? And they said, no. And I get so frustrated and I get angry at myself and I hate school. And I said, okay, would you like to have a meeting where you can tell the teachers this? And the student said no. And I said, would it be okay if mom and I told the teachers this on your behalf? And the kid said yes. And I said, we will make that happen, right? So I gave the option. do you want to be part of this, or would you like the adult? And I said, and they said, I'm too embarrassed, is what it was. And I said, you know what? Sometimes this is what adults are here to do, is to tell other adults what you need. And it was such a nice moment. And it was such an eye opener for everyone. Teachers thought everything was going great because a lot of kids internalize. So giving that self
Mhm.
advocacy, asking questions, and getting kids what they need, even if they're on paper where they need to be.
Absolutely, right? And then there's so many teachers out there who really do pour out their heart into this work, but there's only so much time for them to give individual attention to kids. So it's very easy for like them to miss that. Like they've got a class of often 25, 30 kids. So you don't always get to talk to them or get enough rapport with them for them to, share that with you. So it's awesome that we have this unique opportunity to connect with kids in what is such a busy system for them to like let us know what's going on in the background. And I was gonna say, as far as the collaborating with the kids, like before a lot of these meetings when I was doing SPED or special education, I would be like, "Hey, these are the accommodations you have now, and this is what we've been doing now. Is there anything else you feel like we need to add that you want me to bring up at the
Yes.
meeting?" And they would help me build up what I was gonna go say there because I'm like, this is about you, like. And some if you'd get those kids that were a little resistant, I say, hey, we're not sitting around a meeting talking about each other. We're talking about you. And this has to do with how things are going to go for you during the school day. So let me know, what do you need? Like,
Yeah.
I would hope you want some buy-in on what your day is going to look like, what your experience at school is going to look like.
And from a clinical, I'm just thinking in private practice now, what I do, I've had kids do a variety of things. Or I've even asked this prompt, what would your ideal school look like? What would your ideal
Mm,
classroom look like? And just empowering them to know that you do have some latitude in what goes on, and just working from this really big empowerment advocacy piece. And sometimes I say, they're like, I don't want to go to school ever. And I say, okay, I understand that's your want. I don't make the rules either. The government says you have to go to school, right? And
mhm.
letting them know like why rules exist, right? I didn't make because sometimes I think developmentally appropriate students think that we make the rules, right? And it's like, I did not make this rule that school is mandatory, right? But
Right.
knowing you have to do that until you're 18 years old, what can we do knowing you have to spend your time in this place? So a lot of just empowering psychoed, listening to them, agency, I think is so important. We went
I
on a
so
lot of
agree.
different routes today. Yeah, we went on a lot of different routes today, showing how diverse school social work is. So I guess to wrap up, Mariah, if you could give someone that could be new to the field or has been in the field for 25 years, what is like one piece of advice you would give for people working in school systems from a mental health perspective?
Ooh. While there's so many answers, I'm going to say take care of yourself. Go to
Yes.
therapy yourself, because the way that you care for yourself outside of that is going to be a huge determining factor on the way you show up in those school spaces and how long you last in them. Like, get some good
Yes.
boundaries, get some sense of self, get some confidence in who you are personally and professionally. Um, and just get connected with yourself because you can only get as connected with those people at the school as you are with yourself.
And we teach all these like regulation skills and mind body connection. Use that for yourself, right? That is so
Hmm.
important. Like we said, our nervous
Absolutely.
body tells us what we need to do. If you're starting to get sick, if you're starting to dread going to work, if you are just feeling sluggish and lethargic and you're just like, I don't want to go to this place anymore, use some self-reflection and take care of yourself. Advocate. I have told people, they're like, what do I do if I'm in a stressful situation? I said, evaluate if you have the availability, is it time to find a new job, right? Is it time to
Hmm.
change the space? There's nothing wrong with that. And just be honest with yourself, get the help you need, reach out for support because it's a really tough job, but it's a really important job.
It is. Yeah. And if you end up wanting to switch at some time, there's nothing wrong with that at all. You can always, there's so much you can do with the MSW, whether it be direct practice, indirect, but I just encourage people to keep learning.
Yeah.
Because,
Always.
even, I mean, I'm still, I don't know if I'd be a baby social worker. I'm like pre-seasoned at this point, being in year 5, but I feel like even now, like, even being independently licensed, I still call my manager like once a week and I feel like I'm at Target and I lost my mom. I'm like, Mom, what do I do? Like, where are like I
Yeah,
have these moments or these new unique situations that or challenges that come up that, there's always going to be something new. So it's so important to just keep learning.
absolutely. Keep learning. And I actually have said, I've been in the field now, this will age me over 10 years. The more I'm in the field, the more I know what I don't know. I thought right
That's
out
so
of school,
true.
I knew everything. I just studied all this stuff, but people are complex. And just when I thought I've seen it all or have come across every single thing, something surprises me. So always keep learning, take care of yourself, and keep doing this important work.
Yes, absolutely. And this part will be a conversation for another day, but with the whole like realizing how much we don't know and the uncertainty and complexities of the brain goes into that somatic work because that's literally what you have
Yes.
to be a specialist in. You have to be a specialist in the fact that you don't know anything and that everything is uncertain and
Yes.
that the client is the one that has what they need. We're just there to guide them to getting it. Like, yeah, conversation for another day. I'll end it there though.
Conversation for another day. And I actually that will be my piece of advice for anyone. You are the only person that can be an expert on yourself. That's the only job you can probably ever even be an expert in is on yourself. So know yourself, tap into that. There's no one else that's going to be you. So do you. So I just wanted to here's some resources if anyone is interested in looking at some of the evidence and the research, the scholarly research out there around school social work, specifically around mental health since the COVID-19. Lots of great stuff out there that you can check out. There's been actually, it's really interesting in the literature. Lots of studies are now coming out about those cases that we tracked through the pandemic. So we're going to start to see some really interesting data, I believe, from post-COVID era in the post-COVID era. And then lastly, I want to thank you, Mariah, once again for sharing your knowledge. We'd love to have you back to talk about somatic work, more and more and more things, because we could have continued this conversation on for days. So thank you so
Yes,
much for sharing your expertise.
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Megan.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.